Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaratari Yasodanandana Prajajanaranjanam Yamunatira Panachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaratari Yasodanandana Prajajanaranjana Yamunatira Panachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaratari Yasodanandana Prajajanaranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Kishore Kishori ki jai, Jagannath Maladev Subhadra Marani ki jai, Gonitai ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So today we're reading from Canto 10, chapter 63, and there are two texts for today, 42 and 43. So 42 we'll be chanting together. Yastvam Vishirjate Martam. I knew my computer changed it. Atmaham Priyam Ishvaram Viparyayendriyar Artam Vishamati Armam Tyajan. Computer likes changing things. Okay. Yastvam Vishirjate Madhyam Atmanam Priyam Ishvaram Viparyayendriyartha Artham Visham Ati Amritam Tyajan. Yastam Vishirjate Martyam Atmanam Priyam Ishvaram Viparyayendriya Artha Artham Visham Atsi Amritam Tyajan. Please chant. Yasvam Vishirjate Martyam Atmaham Priyam Ishvaram Viparyayendriya Artha Artham Visham Arti Amritam Tyajan. Yastvam Vishirjate Martyam Atman Priyam Ishvaram Viparyayendriya Artha Artham Visham Ati. Sorry. The word for word, yeah. Who? Tvam, you. Vishirjate, rejects. Martya, mortal man. Atmanam, his true self. Priyam, dearmost. Ishvaram, Lord. Viparyaya, which are just the opposite. Indriya Artha, of sense objects. Artham, for the sake. Visha, poison. Ati, he eats. Amritam, nectar. Tyajan, avoiding. So the translation for text 42 is as follows. So a translation by the disciples of Srila Prabhupada. This mortal who rejects you, in capital letters, his true self, in capital letter, dearmost friend and Lord, for the sake of sense objects, whose nature is just the opposite, refuses nectar and instead consumes poison. And the very short purport. The person described above is pitiable because he rejects that which is actually dear, the Lord, and accepts that which is not dear and is ungodly, temporary, sense gratification, which leads to suffering and bewilderment. And then text 43. Aham brahmata vibhutam mumayas chamalasaya sarvatmana prapanastvam atmanam prestam ishvaram. And the translation for text 43 is as follows. I, Lord Brahma, the other demigods, and the pure-minded sages have all surrendered wholeheartedly unto you, our dearmost self and Lord. Omagyanatimirandasya Gananjana Shlakaya Chakshur Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manopistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shuta Padakamalam Shri Guru Vaishnavam Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Ragutam Vitam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishaka Vitam Shah Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bando Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapsa Kanchana Gorangi Radhe Vrindavan Ishwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Taribhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyeva Cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnebhyo Namo Namaha Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimata Roma Padaswami iti namine Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimata Bhaktivedanta Swami iti namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nivishesha Sunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So I'll just read the English again of text 42. That mortal who rejects you, his true self, dearmost friend and Lord, for the sake of sense objects, whose nature is just the opposite, refuses nectar and instead consumes poison. So the commentary by Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur is very similar to the purport by the disciples of Srila Prabhupada. So presumably it was drawn from Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur because his commentary on text 42 is similar, and he gives a judgment on the person who rejects Lord Krishna in favor of sense objects. So this is what Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, and this is quoting him. He is most pitiable who rejects, and the term in the verse that we read was Vishurjate Tyajati, you, for the sake of sense objects such as children, which are just the opposite, viparyaya viparita, that's with the Sanskrit, are not spiritual, anatma, not dear, priya, and ungodly, anishvara. So it sounds a little bit harsh because generally persons consider their children extremely dear. And in fact, often children are seen as so innocent and, godly almost. But Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur I guess he's chosen that example just to really highlight that there's that choice that's there between Lord Krishna and sense objects, and then he chooses a sense object that generally is seen in such an elevated life, namely a child. So, but his comment is that they're the opposite because they're still representing a sense object. So, not spiritual, not godly. So, and not actually dear. So, there's a view of family that's expressed by Arjuna. You know, it's a classic example. And I found myself bringing up Arjuna's particular conflict over and over again because we spent a week at the Parliament of World Religions. So many persons would say, you know, if they were asked were they familiar with the Bhagavad Gita, they would say, a little, I've read a little. I did a course when I was doing my seminary training on Bhagavad Gita. And anyway, so I spent a lot of time doing the intro to the Bhagavad Gita. So there's a view of family life that's expressed by Arjuna after he's seeing his relatives. So taking into account what Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur has said about sense objects, and generally that one views family members as very dear, as very spiritual, or that one's relationship with them that way. So this is something that's of great interest because Arjuna actually became overwhelmed by grief and compassion. And he spoke the following words when he saw his relatives on the opposing side on the battlefield. So this is from Bhagavad Gita in the first chapter, in the 27th verse. Arjuna said, "O Krishna, seeing my relatives and friends present before me with a desire to fight, the limbs of my body are trembling and my mouth is drying up." And he continues, "My body is trembling, my hair is standing on end, my Gandiva bow and arrows are slipping from my hands, and my skin is burning." So there's a huge physiological reaction that's even happening just at the thought that here are relatives and friends that are considered so dear that are actually willing to fight and actually engage in battle and even kill him. So, or even that he has to do the same thing. And he says, "I'm unable to stand here any longer, and my mind is terribly bewildered." So it's a reflection on that attachment that's there and how dear family members are viewed in the mind. And he says, "I do not see anything beneficial in killing my relatives in battle, O Krishna. I have no desire for victory, a kingdom, or happiness at their cost." So finally he says, "O Govinda, of what use is a kingdom, the enjoyment of happiness, and even life itself, when the very people for whom we desire these things are standing before us on the battlefield?" So it shows the extent of that close kind of connection and the view in the mind that one holds of family members. I mean, this great physiological reaction that Arjuna is experiencing. You know, he can't even hold his bow, and he's a warrior, a very strong warrior. Even the bow is falling out of his hand. And, you know, this final statement that even what's the use of a kingdom, or even the happiness that comes from having a kingdom, when life itself, so it's considered as part of his very own life, that connection to family members. He says, the desire for the kingdom would be for those persons. So it's like very selfless. But here they're standing on the battlefield, and it's going to be a fight to the death. So So he continues, O Madhusudana, when teachers, fathers, sons, maternal uncles, fathers-in-law, grandsons, brothers-in-law, and other relatives and friends are prepared to sacrifice their lives in this battle, why should I desire to kill them, even though they're prepared to kill me? So, it's expressing presumably a very noble sentiment because uh, he's putting so much value on that relationship. And Arjuna now states, certainly we will become tainted with sin if we kill Dhritarashtra's sons as well as our friends and relatives, even though they are aggressors. O Madhava, what will we gain by killing our own kinsmen, and how will we achieve happiness in this way? So it's a very relevant question. And this is sort of how he's concluding that it's going to be sinful to kill all his relatives, even though they're aggressors, because they had actually, you could say, taken the land that rightfully belonged to the Pandavas, Arjuna's side, because that's one in the category of aggressors. So Arjuna was giving consideration. So he understood that there's different categories of aggressors, and in this particular battlefield, his own teachers, friends, sons, grandsons, etc., there was a certain aggression because they were prepared to kill him. And because these were family members, Arjuna was thinking that he should not take the severe steps necessary against ordinary aggressors. So, you always want to be more lenient with persons that you care for. And certainly if you consider them your very life, you're going to be much more lenient. So he was considering that perhaps he shouldn't actually be taking the severe steps that were necessary against persons who were aggressors. And just to put it into perspective, there's 6 kinds of aggressors. One is a person who gives poison. A second one is a person who sets fire to one's house. A third aggressor is one who attacks with deadly weapons. So already everybody in front of him could be considered aggressors because they're ready to attack with deadly weapons. A fourth aggressor is one who plunders riches. So in fact, also the opposing side, they had plundered the riches that belonged to the Pandavas. The whole kingdom had been taken from them. So, they were aggressors on 2 scores. A fifth aggressor is one who occupies another's land. They also fell into that category. They were occupying land that belonged to the Pandavas. And sixth is one who kidnaps a wife. So you can see the incredible dilemma that's there with considering persons being one's very life, and that they fall into the category of aggressors, and that actually it's one's duty to start to engage in battle, but one is reluctant to do it because these persons represent everything that gives one happiness. So Srila Prabhupada notes that saintly persons generally are advised to forgive such injunctions. For saintly persons, it's more important than some political emergency. So this element of forgiveness is actually an injunction for a saintly person. So Arjuna's consideration was that rather than kill his own kinsmen for political reasons, it would be better to forgive them on the grounds of religious or saintly behavior. So that was his consideration. It's more important to go with the injunction for a saintly person rather than go with the part of taking the step of chastising aggressors. So this is what he was thinking. So going deeper into what the conflict was for him. And this is just to highlight this particular point of how one views sense objects and how it actually puts one directly into conflict with what Krishna may be wanting or not wanting. So this is how Srila Prabhupada explains the logic of Arjuna. He says, he did not therefore consider such killing profitable, simply for the matter of temporary body happiness. After all, kingdoms are pleasure, and pleasure derived therefrom are not permanent. So why should he risk his life and eternal salvation by killing his own kinsman? So this was the logic Arjuna was using, put into context by Srila Prabhupada. And Srila Prabhupada identifies that there's a certain value that's held by Arjuna. And that value is, you could say, it's defined as what's a matter of importance. That's what Arjuna's looking at. What's most important? So the value of viewing one's family members as one's own life, that important? Or is it actually more important to consider bringing aggressors, taking the steps necessary to punish aggressors? So, a value was being looked at. So there's two values that are in the balance here. So Arjuna, he also showed another value. He was also looking at other values. There was the value of satisfaction, because, by your actions, are you going to have happiness and satisfaction? So he values, obviously, happiness and satisfaction. And that was looked at in the context of the acquisition of a kingdom. Because if he's fighting, as a victor, he's going to gain a kingdom. So you have to consider that what do you value? Is what you're going to gain going to bring happiness and satisfaction? So, and naturally, getting a kingdom means that there's a lot of pleasure that's going to be acquired from greater wealth and all the accoutrements that come with having a kingdom. So Arjuna was also looking at that. He understood, it's a value for him, happiness. So he gave consideration to that in relation to acquiring a kingdom. So now Lord Krishna addresses the value placed on happiness by saying, this is Lord Krishna's words, one who is not connected with the Supreme in Krishna consciousness can have neither transcendental intelligence nor a steady mind, without which there is no possibility of peace. And how can there be any happiness without peace? So notice the brilliant, extraordinary answer, and that's highlighting the very thing that Lord Shiva is bringing up, that often there's this choice between a sense object and Lord Krishna. And here's Lord Krishna saying that actually, looking at that value of happiness, you can't have happiness without peace. And you're not going to be able to be peaceful unless you have a steady mind. The only way you're going to have a steady mind is actually if you're practicing Krishna consciousness. So it's very interesting. And that's from Bhagavad Gita 266, where Krishna addresses this value of happiness. Now, Srila Vishwanath puts it this way. For one, and it's looking at the same particular argument of Lord Krishna's, for one who has not controlled the mind, there is no intelligence, no prajna fixed on the soul. For one who has not such prajna arising from a controlled mind, which is meditation on the Supreme, is also, for one who has not such prajna arising from a controlled mind, which is meditation on the Supreme, and then, sorry, something got lost here. But the same idea that actually you can't have that happiness, you can't have that peace unless you're actually meditating on the Supreme, because that's what brings the steady mind and it gives intelligence. So actually, if you're not meditating on the Supreme, there's no intelligence. So you can't even evaluate properly. You can't make proper decisions. You can't weigh up different values. You can't actually reach sound conclusions. So because it has to come from connection with the teachings related to the scriptures, and that means it has to come from a soul level, from the deepest level, to be able to actually utilize intelligence properly. You have to see through the eyes of scripture. So Srila Prabhupada explains that there has to be an ultimate goal within the mind, and that is the reason for disturbance, when there's a want of an ultimate goal. So generally the mind is always, I like this, I don't like that. I prefer this, I don't prefer that. So it's always wavering between two options, because the mind needs the intelligence to actually direct it in a particular way, and also have the proper reasoning process and the proper logical process that allows for the mind then to move in the right direction, either the preferred one or the not preferred direction, whichever the intelligence directs it. And to have that intelligence requires that meditation on the Supreme Lord, because that's the source of intelligence. And so there has to be a goal in the mind. This is what Srila Prabhupada says. Because if you don't have a goal in your mind, that's when the mind's always going to be a little bit disturbed. Should it be this? Should it be that? So if one wants to set such a goal within the mind, and so make a choice in the direction of Krishna, then one would understand Krishna to be the one who's the enjoyer of all the results of any sacrifice. And one would see him also as the proprietor of all the universal affairs. And one would also see him as the friend of all living entities. So that's what the mind has to be carrying. That's the goal that has to be present in the mind for it actually to be able to respond to the intelligence and actually work under the direction of intelligence. So one has to be carrying around a certain understanding of Krishna, that he's actually a friend, that actually he is the person who should enjoy the result of any sacrifice one makes. So is it going to be a sacrifice of, one's family members? Is it going to be a sacrifice of a kingdom? What is it going to be in the case of Arjuna? Still, there has to be that present in the mind has to be that goal. Krishna is going to be the recipient of my sacrifice. And also, he's the owner of everything in the world. So actually, I need to work under his direction to actually fit harmoniously into how he's ordered all the universal affairs. So it's necessary to have that goal in the mind to actually even have the proper intelligence. So holding such an understanding within the mind, setting an ultimate goal within the mind, leads to an extraordinary consequence, which is contained in Krishna spelling out the consequence to Arjuna. So here's Krishna is spelling it out to Arjuna. O mighty armed one whose senses are restrained from their object is certainly of steady intelligence. So here comes the important part. There's this amazing consequence that the senses have to be restrained for there to be steady intelligence. And Srila Vishwanath paraphrases, this is from Bhagavad Gita 269. O mighty armed one, just as you control your enemies with your strength, you should control your mind. So this curbing of the senses, and the mind is the king of the senses. It's the area where the enjoyment lies, when you gather in all the information. The mind is the sense that's actually getting the enjoyment. Um, so this curbing of the senses, it's not possible by human effort. This is the extraordinary thing. But only by keeping the senses engaged in the service of the Lord. So, you sometimes see persons, there may be a great weakness. So, the weakness may take whichever form, some bad habit. Persons will keep going back to the same bad habit, even though they may for a while stay away from it, because in the mind, that kind of goal is not there, why they're performing particular activities, and also that capacity, because the intelligence gets steady because of the ideas held in the mind, the goal in the mind, then it becomes possible to actually stay away from the bad habit. Otherwise, one will keep going back to the bad habit. And that's the thing. It's not possible to curb the senses by human effort alone, but only by keeping the senses engaged in the service of the Lord. So, by way of illustrating the curbing of an enemy, there's an interesting account of the toppling of a dictator's regime. When I was growing up in Africa, there was one of the things that would happen is that after colonialism, there was this whole wave of African dictators that would take over a country. So the colonialists would move out, and some African would rise to prominence, and then he would have a very cruel regime controlling the people. So one that I found completely fascinating when I was growing up was in Uganda, there was a dictator, Idi Amin, and he was known for extreme cruelty. And so there was this thought, how is he ever going to be toppled? Because he had everything, very well controlled. So what it took, and I'm using this as an example for how you curb an enemy. So he was actually an enemy of the people just by virtue of his cruelty. And it actually took a neighboring country. The Tanzanians took pity on the Ugandans. So a whole army of 40,000 Tanzanians marched into Uganda, and there was just like maybe 2,000 Ugandan soldiers that had somehow the courage and the strength to rise up against Idi Amin. So it took 40,000 Tanzanians coming from a neighboring country to try and topple the regime, and indeed they did it. So I always think of that as the most wonderful example of the curbing of an enemy, just because when they arrived in Kampala, the head place, and they went to the offices where his intelligence unit was, they found all the papers, because there were accounts kept of how people were controlled. And while they were rifling through the papers, they had to control their nausea because the stench of rotting corpses in the same building was so strong it was coming up. So anyway, I always think of that as a wonderful example of the curbing of an enemy, the Tanzanian bravery to topple Idi Amin. So going back to this horror, you could say, of focusing on sense objects. There's another consequence that's painted by Lord Krishna. This is what he puts it. As an unfavorable wind blows a boat off course, the mind of a restless person plunders his intelligence, being induced by the urges of his senses. So see what a danger there is if one's focusing on sense objects without having that meditation on the supreme that needs to be there. The intelligence becomes plundered. So in fact, a person who chooses to focus on sense object, even a family member, So one would think, what is the fault with actually focusing on a family member and wanting the best for them and putting all one's energies into that? Actually, the intelligence is plundered because the mind doesn't have the proper focus. The proper focus should not be on the sense object, it should be on Lord Krishna. So it means that actually the intelligence goes. One actually can't direct the mind in a proper way. So then there's that extreme attachment to a result, and naturally it's going to lead to some unhappiness because things don't work, or material nature doesn't work that way, that just what one conceives of in one's attachment, therefore things must actually become, that must be the result that happens. It doesn't work that way. And in fact, one's intelligence doesn't work properly. So even what one is wanting, one can't even achieve it properly because the mind is not actually meditating on the Supreme Lord, because he's the source of intelligence and he will actually direct things in the way that's most beneficial for every person because he's the friend of every living entity. So again, that example, it's like a boat on the water and it's been swept away by a strong wind. Even one of the senses, so a sense maybe one's, topmost sense, the mind, may be focused on a family member and the success one wants one's family member to have. But that focus will carry away a person's intelligence. So that's, Krishna explains that in Bhagavad Gita 2.67. So this is the compromise of a choice, the choice that Lord Shiva calls a pitiable choice. That's Lord Shiva's view. The senses are not engaged in the service of the Lord, or even one of them is engaged, or the senses may be engaged, but one of them gets gratified. Even one of the senses getting gratified. Then one falls from the path of transcendental advancement. And this is the Sanskrit for 267 because it's so significant in this discussion. Indriyanam hi charatam yatmano nuvidyate tadasya harati prajnam vayur navam ivam basi. So this is a statement made by Lord Krishna that highlights the effect of the choice for sense objects, the pitiable choice from Lord Shiva's perspective, and the strong position of those choosing Lord Krishna as their meditative object. So here's Bhagavad Gita 270. Sense enjoyers can never attain peace. Just as the river cannot disturb an ocean while entering it, material desires cannot agitate the mind of an introspective sage. Only one who tolerates the constant appearance of material desires can attain peace, and not the person who tries to satisfy them. So extraordinary, you could say, comparison between the two positions. So the person focused on sense objects cannot attain peace. Whereas the person who's actually meditating on the Supreme Lord, he's actually able to tolerate the different material desires. He's able to have the steady mind. It doesn't get agitated. So this is the platform of self-realization. It's a transcendental stage. And on that platform, one is never bewildered. So even at the time of death, such a person can enter the kingdom of God. This is the final verse in chapter 2. Just like King Kajanga, this is from Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. So the state of transcendence is distinct from material consciousness. That's the point. When one attains this platform, one relishes the transcendental mallow of love of God. So that's the internal position. One's in this state of relishing. One's in a state of happiness because one's relishing that mallow, that mood of love of God. And there is indeed a story that Lord Shiva tells pertaining to the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita. So I've been drawing a lot from the second chapter just to highlight Lord Shiva's particular, how he puts it as two parallel paths, the path of looking at sense objects versus meditating on Lord Krishna. So he tells a story to Parvati where there's a particular personality, Devashama, who sees a particular scene, and this is the scene he sees. A tiger on the bank of a river, he encounters one of Devashama's goats. So this was a saintly personality. The tiger, when he sees the goat, he loses all his anger and his desire to eat the goat. Thereupon, that goat inquires from the tiger, "You have attained your food, so why are you not eating the meat of my body? You should immediately kill me and with great relish eat up my flesh." So the goat is very puzzled. And so this particular little story that Lord Shiva is relating has to do with the fact that the saintly personality was meditating on Lord Krishna, and so even his goats were completely peaceful. And when a tiger entered the scene, the atmosphere was saturated with that mood of focus on the Supreme Lord and love for the Supreme Lord, that even the tiger lost his anger. And he didn't want to kill the goat or eat the goat. And the goat was very puzzled and could even converse with the tiger and say, "Well, why? You should be killing me and relishing my flesh. Why are you not doing so?" So it had to do with the whole atmosphere was saturated with this love for Lord Krishna. Um, um, so there's further, Lord Shiva also in glorifying the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita, he speaks of a particular sage, Sukama, who daily used to read the verses of the second chapter. And this sage says, by reading the verses of the second chapter, quickly one will attain one's goal. And so Sukama himself, and this is Lord Shiva, of course it's in a little bit more detail, but Sukama took that path of reciting these verses daily for the rest of his life. And very quickly he attained complete understanding of Lord Krishna just by reading the verses of reciting them every day, the second chapter. And he felt no more hunger or thirst. So that particular glory of the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita, Lord Shiva using two different examples, was in both cases there was a complete loss of that desire to gratify the senses, even hunger and thirst, which are like the strongest pulling of the body, even that just faded with recitation of the verses of the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita. So finally, in text 43, which I'll read again, just as a reminder, this is Lord Shiva talking. "I, Lord Brahma, the other demigods, and the pure-minded sages have all surrendered wholeheartedly unto you, our dearmost self and Lord." So this is Lord Shiva's saying to Lord Krishna. And Srila Vishwanath comments in this way. Shiva informs Lord Krishna, "My fighting against you for the sake of Banasura, who is not the super soul, nor dear, and not the supreme controller, means that I myself rejected nectar and took poison." So in the previous verse, the whole verse that I've been elaborating on through looking at it very systematically, in Arjuna's situation and how Krishna is responding when there is that focus on sense objects, Lord Shiva was in fact condemning himself. He saw himself as, just by virtue of the fact that he took that step to fight, he's actually seen himself as having made a choice in the direction of sense objects. And Srila Vishwanath spells it out that Lord Shiva is actually saying, for the sake of Banasura, I was fighting against you. So, and it's for the sake of Banasura, who's not the super soul, who's not dear, and is not the supreme controller. So it's like going against all the goal that one has in one's mind, in one's sense. So this is what Lord Shiva then ends up concluding and stating to Lord Krishna. So if there's any comment on these two verses or thoughts to expand the discussion, or some thought even on the analysis.
I was just thinking that this expression of Lord Shiva at the end, that he is lamenting that he have taken poison because of fighting against Krishna, seems to be more an expression of humility from Lord Shiva, since back, in previous verses, um, there was the explanation that he wanted, his desire was to glorify Krishna while performing that action. So, so it was his mindset was devotional, was not bewildered or covered by sense objects. So so then is it fake that he's expressing like that? And we know that the acharyas, in many occasions, they very sincerely express, have those expressions of humility towards the Lord, and then they genuinely feel, Srila Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami say he's a worm in the stool, and there's a genuine feeling of being very small and insufficient in front of the Lord. So possibly, this is something to do with the expression of Lord Shiva.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, one's attitude and mood is certainly going to be one of great humility when one is meditating on Lord Krishna. And as you pointed out, Lord Shiva, even his fighting was a meditation on Lord Krishna. It's he's doing bringing out one weapon is being counteracted by Lord Krishna with an opposing weapon. But he goes through all the fighting, which was a dutiful action because he had agreed to protect Banasura's city. So when Krishna and the entourage arrived, he went through it, but in a meditative mood. And so your point that actually he's expressing humility here, where he's actually speaking to Lord Krishna, where he's pointing out that, it's as though he focused on the sense object, meaning Banasura, and specifically he's highlighting he's not dear, he's not the super soul, he's not my very self. So that it would be an expression of humility. That's a very nice point, and it does tie in with Lord Shiva's particular mood and the fact that his fighting was of a meditative nature. The thought that came to me also was that there's still the thing that he went into a clash with Lord Krishna. So there can be an expression or necessity to still explain or state it clearly to Lord Krishna. Basically, Banasura is not the supreme controller. Banasura is not dear. I mean, one would just in a civil way still want to state it. So, I mean, naturally, Krishna knows perfectly well, and Lord Shiva had the right mood, and it's not that he was going in the direction of focusing on the sense object Banasura, his dear disciple, and he did everything dutifully, and he's on a transcendental plane, but it's only correct to reiterate the point. I think it's almost like you could say a kind of courtesy. You have to. Yeah, so thank you for the thought. Well, that ends this Srimad Bhagavatam class. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai.